my decision to write McMafia emerged out of two things. First of all, that I was also, while I was doing Yugoslavia, I would also travel to other parts of Eastern Europe, including Russia. And I noticed that organized crime was a very important part of the transition from communism to free market, the free market in those territories as well. And then in March 2003, the Prime Minister of Serbia at the time, a man named Zoran Đinđić, who I had known for about 20 years at this point, was assassinated in the middle of Belgrade, partly because Zoran Đinđić was, I thought, a very positive politician for Serbia, and partly because he was a friend of mine. I investigated the background to his murder, and the person who was eventually convicted of his murder was a man whose nickname in Serbian is Legija, which means legionnaire. And Legija disappeared from Serbia for 2 years after the murder. And then 2 years later, he reappeared in Belgrade and gave himself up to the police and was eventually convicted. But he had been protected for 2 years after Đinđić's death by a Croat nationalist group in a part of Croatia that was also run by an organized criminal figure. And so I said, wait a minute here, this is very odd that you have a Serbian nationalist being protected by a Croatian nationalist, because the Serbs and Croats in the Yugoslav war were very hostile to each other. And the reason I discovered that he was protected by the Croatian national group was revealed by his nickname, Legionnaire, because he and Petrac, the Croatian guy who was protected him, they had both been members of the French Foreign Legion during the 1980s. And they had established a very close friendship then. And during the entire Yugoslav wars, they were cooperating, even when, in theory, they were fighting on other sides, in order to shift illicit goods and services, which were coming from all over the world, into the biggest market for illicit goods and services in history, which is the European Union, because you have, at this point, you're approaching up to 500 million consumers in the European Union, 500 million consumers who have a lot of extra cash and who like to indulge in buying untaxed cigarettes and sleeping with women who've been trafficked for sexual purposes and sticking 50-euro notes up their nose. And so I began to see the organized crime and the militias in a rather different way, as actually having a very important function in a large business chain. But because these figures were emerging not just in a war zone like Yugoslavia, but also everywhere else in Eastern Europe, I was interested to know why that was, and why was it that figures from Russia and Serbia were pitching up in places like Aruba in the Mediterranean and in Colombia and in South Africa. So all over the world, these weird transitions were going on, which nobody was really able to monitor or map. And so when I sort of stumbled across this, I decided what I would do is I would try and map the emergence of a globalizing organized crime which exploited the mechanisms of globalization to its advantage. And one of the things that it found there very conveniently was the existence of tax havens all over the world. And the real speciality of tax havens is you can form companies and invest companies with money without revealing who you are. And so tax havens around the world, although they protest their innocence, are in fact machines for laundering money so that you can take money that emerges out of political corruption or organized crime and bring it into the licit world and pretend that you are in fact a good citizen of whatever jurisdiction was going on. On the whole, once you discover the key to getting in touch with people who operate in the shadow economy, or the underworld as we used to call it, it's actually quite easy to talk to them, because people, whether they're involved in organized crime, whether they're involved in corporate work, whether they're politicians, whether they're people who work in NGOs, whether they're victims, people have one thing which enjoins most of them, and that is they like to talk about themselves. So that if you can find a way of getting somebody to open up, then they'll chat to you till the cows come home about what they do. So when you meet somebody who's involved in organized crime, what you don't do is say to them, so what does it feel like to be a mass murderer? You know, how can you look at your son or your daughter in the eye knowing what you've done the day before? And what I do with all my interviews, and when I interview people, regardless of where they come from, I interview them over many hours. And I always start off with a question asking them where they were born, what their parents did for a living, and start describing their childhood to me and where they went to school and that sort of thing. And what that does is it gets people to start revealing their own narrative. And by the time it comes to them becoming involved in some form of criminal activity, they're talking 10 to the dozen, you know, and they're very sort of open about what they do. I'm not as interested in the moral culpability of people I interview. What I'm really interested in is how their business works, what their role in it is, how they see the world. And so what I try and do with the work that I do is explain to people why the world is working as it is, and then it's up to the reader or the viewer or whoever it is to make a decision as to whether that person and that person's engagement is, in the reader's mind, moral, immoral, amoral, or whatever. I would look at a story and then I would follow it. This is in English. I would follow it in English around its sources. And you would find a story, and then you'd see that it was reported in another newspaper, which was reported in a news agency, which reported from a blog, and so on. And what you would see is the circularity of information that goes around the internet. That actually what you think is a revelation of a story is in fact a regurgitation. So you get a kind of caricature of an interesting incident. Then what I do is, if I'm in a position to do so, i.e. if it's an Indo-European language, I will go to the original language. And then you will see a different version of the story which has come out on English. And in the original version, you'll find out much more about the people involved. And that if you think that this is an important and interesting story about, say, cocaine smuggling through South Africa or through West Africa into Europe, you then have to go in situ and you have to talk to the people involved. And what the internet has done, unfortunately, is that it has encouraged a lot of people engaged in journalism and media to get their information from not just secondary but tertiary and beyond sources. So that for all of the information that we have on the internet, the only way that you're going to get a really powerful, good, interesting story is if you go to in media res, to the heart of the matter, and you talk to the people involved. And if I'd written McMafia from the stories that I'd picked up on the internet, and then written McMafia as I did write it, they would be two unrecognizable books. And this is a big paradox about the internet. We have never had access to as much information as we do now, but we have never had as much access to information which is entirely bullshit and bears no relationship to actually what happened. So for that reason, investigative journalism and going in and investigating things where they are supposed to have happened or where they actually are happened is never more important than it is now, but the economic structure which existed before is unfortunately no longer there. So if you're engaged in investigative journalism, you have a whole range of problems facing you, both in terms of gathering information, finding sources, writing it up, and frankly, above all else, funding it.